A priest wanted to bring his church into the modern age, so he created an anonymous online confessional. At first, it was just small sins. But then, a new user appeared. His first message read, "Father, I want to tell you about the garden I am growing in my basement, but instead of flowers, there are human bones." The screen flickered in the semi-darkness of the cell, the sole source of light casting trembling shadows on the rows of old books and the wooden crucifix on the wall. Father Michael opened the tab for the anonymous confession chat, his own innovation, designed to reach out to those lost in the hustle of the 21st century. He saw it as a digital extension of the confessional's sanctity, a quiet harbor in the storm of modern life. The idea had been met with skepticism by the older clergy, but the steady flow of users had proven its necessity. He felt a quiet pride in this bridge he had built. The first messages were familiar, echoes of the whispers he heard through the wooden lattice every week. Minor transgressions, domestic quarrels, the shadows of doubt that crept into the souls of city dwellers. One user confessed to lying to their spouse about a small debt. Another admitted to a surge of envy toward a colleague's promotion. Father Michael typed his replies with care, his fingers moving silently over the keyboard, offering words of counsel and prayers for peace. Each digital absolution felt as real, as meaningful, as one spoken aloud in the hallowed quiet of the church. As the hours bled from late evening into the deep of night, the city outside muted its roar to a distant, rhythmic hum. The silence within the monastery walls grew heavier, more profound. A draft slipped through the old window frame, carrying with it the cold scent of impending rain and making a candle stub sputter in its holder. He felt a weariness settle into his bones, the kind that came after a long day of shouldering the spiritual burdens of others. He considered closing the laptop, but a sense of duty, a feeling that someone might still need him, kept his eyes fixed on the screen. He was about to finally log off when a small notification chimed, a soft, almost apologetic sound in the stillness. A new user had entered the chat. He clicked on the window, his practiced motions automatic. But this was different. The other users had chosen anonymous but descriptive names, Lost Soul 78, Seeking Guidance, Troubled Heart. This one was starkly minimal. A single letter in the username field. The cursor blinked next to it, a patient, rhythmic pulse in the digital void. An odd chill, unrelated to the draft from the window, traced a path down his spine. He watched as the three small dots appeared, indicating that the user was typing. They appeared and vanished and appeared again, as if the writer were hesitating, choosing their words with immense care or profound difficulty. Then, the message loaded. It was not a plea for forgiveness or a confession of a common frailty. It was a single, perfectly formed sentence that seemed to suck all the air and warmth from the small cell. "Father, I want to tell you about the garden I am growing in my basement, but instead of flowers, there are human bones." Father Michael stared, his breath caught in his throat. The words did not compute. They were a string of characters that his mind refused to assemble into a coherent, believable thought. It had to be a prank. Some disturbed youth playing a cruel game, testing the limits of the anonymity he had offered. He read the sentence again. And a third time. The clinical simplicity of the statement, its lack of frantic emotion or dramatic flair, was what made it so utterly terrifying. It was presented as a fact, a simple truth being shared in the sanctity of confession. He looked away from the screen, toward the crucifix on the wall. The carved face of Christ seemed to gaze back at him from the shadows, its expression unchanging, serene. But there was no comfort there now. The quiet of his cell was no longer a peaceful sanctuary. It was a vacuum, now filled with the monstrous image of a subterranean garden of horrors. The blinking cursor in the reply box for user S was a silent, insistent demand. All the petty sins and anxieties he had absolved that evening dissolved into nothingness, trivial specters in the face of this absolute, bone-chilling darkness. The routine established itself with the grim finality of a death sentence. Every night, just after the 11th hour, the notification would sound. It was no longer a surprise, but a promise. Father Michael would sit, the laptop's glow painting his face in pale, sickly light, and read the latest dispatch from hell. Never wasted time with greetings. The messages began abruptly, continuing a narrative that seemed to have no beginning and, he feared, no end. The digital confessional had become a nightly ritual of damnation, and he its unwilling priest. SS texts were not the frantic ramblings of a madman. They were articulate, precise, and imbued with a terrifying lucidity. They were canvases of perverse fantasy, detailed to the point of nausea. The garden was a recurring metaphor, a place of carefully curated suffering. S described the soil, the despair of the victims, and the nutrients, their pleas and their pain. The writing was cold and detached, like a botanist's journal, making the grotesque subject matter even more obscene. Each sentence was a carefully polished stone laid on a path leading deeper into darkness. At first, Father Michael tried to rationalize it. This was an elaborate, cruel fiction. Perhaps S was a writer of extreme horror, using him as a sounding board for their depraved work. He clung to this idea, repeating it to himself like a mantra during the daylight hours. But the belief was a flimsy shield. There was a sincerity, an authenticity in the prose that defied dismissal. The words felt less like fiction and more like testimony. They carried the weight of acts committed, not just imagined. The doubt was a seed that S had planted, and it was beginning to sprout. Sleep became a forgotten country. He would lie on his simple cot, eyes wide open in the oppressive darkness, his mind replaying phrases and images from the chat. When exhaustion finally claimed him, it was not for rest, but for short, sticky lapses into anxiety. He would dream of tangled roots in dark soil and wake with a gasp, his heart hammering against his ribs. The silence of his cell, once a source of peace and contemplation, no longer offered any comfort. It rang with the memory of unspoken horrors and the dreadful anticipation of the next notification. The messages evolved, growing more specific. S began to describe scenarios of cruelty that would make even a seasoned police detective shudder. These were no longer abstract metaphors about a garden. They were detailed accounts of psychological torment, of hope systematically dismantled, of bodies pushed beyond the limits of endurance. Father Michael found himself reading with a morbid, horrified fascination, his mind building the scenes against his will. The letters on the screen became flesh and blood and terror, images that were seared into his memory, impossible to unsee. This digital poison began to seep through the monitor, contaminating his world. During Mass, he would look out at the faces of his parishioners and see not faith, but a collection of secret vulnerabilities. The old woman in the third pew, the young couple holding hands, the choir boy with the angelic voice, what darkness did they hide? What weakness would S find in them? The act of offering communion felt like a hypocrisy. How could he speak of salvation when his own mind was a captive audience to such profound and methodical evil? His hands, holding the host, would sometimes tremble. He tried to fight back. He would type responses filled with scripture, with pleas for repentance, with arguments for the sanctity of life and the possibility of redemption. He wrote of God's infinite mercy, of the grace that could wash away any sin. It was like shouting into a void. SS replies were swift, clinical, and devastating. They dissected his faith with surgical precision, turning his words back on him. Mercy, S wrote, is a fiction for the weak. I offer clarity. I offer an end to the disease of hope. Is that not a purer form of grace? The laptop, once a tool of outreach, became a malevolent artifact on his desk. It was a portal, a direct line to a consciousness that was antithetical to everything he believed. He felt its presence even when it was closed, a low hum of potential dread in the quiet of his cell. Several times, he stood over it, his hand raised, wanting to smash it to pieces, to shatter the screen and silence the voice forever. But he never could. An awful, addictive curiosity held him back. He had to know what came next. He had to bear witness, even if it was destroying him. The moral conflict was a torment. His mind screamed at him to go to the authorities, to report this. But what would he say? He would show them anonymous, untraceable chat logs filled with what they would surely call elaborate, sick fiction. They would look at him, a priest, and see a man unhinged by loneliness or religious fervor. And beneath that practical fear was a more profound, spiritual trap, the seal of the confessional. S had come to him in a space he had designated as sacred. Did that seal apply even to this digital monstrosity? The question was a labyrinth in his mind. SS philosophy was a twisted parody of religious doctrine. The acts of cruelty were not sins, but sacraments in a dark new faith. The victims were not people, but offerings. S spoke of purifying them, of stripping away the illusions of self, until only the raw, true essence of their suffering remained. You see sin as a stain, S typed one night. I see it as the only honest thing in the universe. I do not create it. I merely cultivate it to its most perfect and beautiful form. I am a gardener of souls, Father. Just like you. The physical world started to feel thin, unreal. The taste of bread was bland, the light of the sun was a pale imitation of true illumination. The ancient stones of the monastery felt like a stage set. His own reflection in the small, cracked mirror in the washroom was that of a stranger, a pale, haunted man with dark circles under his eyes like bruises. The real world, the world of substance and meaning, was contained in the glowing rectangle of the screen and the words that appeared there each night. The cell, his entire world, was shrinking to the size of that laptop. His prayers became desperate and hollow. He would kneel on the cold stone floor until his knees ached, pleading for guidance, for strength, for a sign that God was still present in a world that could contain a mind like S. But his words felt empty, echoing back at him from the vaulted ceiling of the chapel. He was speaking to God, but his thoughts were in a metaphorical basement, wandering through a garden of bones. The face of Christ on the cross seemed to be watching him, its expression not of solace, but of shared, eternal sorrow. He began to lose track of time. Days blurred into a gray cycle of performing his duties on autopilot, his mind entirely consumed by the waiting. He would eat without tasting, walk without seeing, speak without listening. Every conversation was a distraction, every toll of the church bell an interruption of his vigil. His only purpose, it seemed, was to receive the nightly transmission, to absorb the poison that S so willingly offered. He was no longer a priest. He was a vessel, a repository for the filth of another's soul. The horror had a new texture now. It was not just the content of the messages, but the effect they were having on him. He found himself analyzing the people around him with a cold, detached eye, just as S described. He would notice a flicker of fear in someone's expression, a hint of desperation in their voice, and a part of his mind, a newly colonized part, would catalogue it as a weakness. The poison was not just being observed, it was being absorbed, changing the very structure of his thoughts, remaking him an SS image. One evening, driven by a desperate nostalgia for his own lost innocence, he opened the archives of the anonymous chat from the first few months. The messages seemed to come from another lifetime. People confessing to petty theft, to lustful thoughts, to moments of anger. Their sins were so simple, so human. He felt a profound wave of grief for the men he had been then, the priest who had believed that this digital outreach was an unequivocal good, a way to bring light into the shadows. Now he knew that the shadows could also use it to reach out. His faith, once a mighty fortress, was now a ruin. S had not assaulted it with a single, mighty blow, but had dismantled it stone by stone with cold, patient logic. The concepts of good and evil, of damnation and salvation, had been twisted into unrecognizable shapes. If God was all-powerful and all-loving, how could S exist? And if a soul could become so utterly, articulately evil, what hope was there for the flawed, stumbling masses he ministered to every day? The purity of the human soul was a comforting lie he could no longer afford to believe. And so he would wait. As the sun set and the monastery settled into its nightly quiet, he would boot up the laptop. The act itself was now a form of prayer, a submission to a power he could not comprehend. He was a prisoner in his own cell, chained to the screen by a force more binding than iron. He would sit and stare at the empty chat window, his entire being focused on a single point of dreadful anticipation, the chime of a new notification, the appearance of a single, damning letter. S. For a week, the silence from S was absolute. Father Michael found himself checking the chat with a compulsive, nervous energy, his hope a fragile, flickering thing. Perhaps the vile wellspring had run dry. Perhaps the disturbed individual had moved on, their cruel game concluded. He allowed himself to breathe a little easier, to sleep in longer stretches, the grotesque images from the screen beginning to recede like a fever dream. The quiet of his cell started to feel like his own again. Then, on the 8th night, the notification chimed, and the fragile piece shattered into 1,000 pieces. The message that appeared was different. It lacked the usual elaborate, gruesome fantasy. It was short, direct, and grounded in the mundane reality of his parish. Old Mrs. Eleonora is so distressed about her lost brooch, it read. The little silver bird with the sapphire eye. She believes it fell from her coat during morning prayer yesterday. She should look more carefully by the main donation box. It is caught on the edge of the velvet runner. Father Michael's blood ran cold. He knew Mrs. Eleonora, a devout, gentle soul. And he knew the brooch, a cherished heirloom she wore every Sunday. He fought the urge to dismiss it. Anyone could have seen her wearing it. Anyone could have overheard her lamenting its loss. It was a guess, a cruel and clever trick to make him believe in an omniscience that wasn't there. But the detail about the donation box, the velvet runner, it felt too specific. The following morning, his heart pounding with a dread that felt sacrilegious in the holy space, he went to the main nave. He knelt, pretending to adjust his cassock, and ran his hand along the edge of the red velvet runner. His fingers brushed against something small and metallic. It was the silver bird, its sapphire eye glinting in the light from the stained glass windows. The barrier between the digital nightmare and his physical world had been breached. The horror was no longer confined to the glowing screen, it was walking the aisles of his church. It was observing his flock. He felt a profound sense of violation, as if a leering, unseen face were pressed against the confessional screen, its gaze penetrating every corner of his parish, every secret of his parishioners' hearts. The knowledge was an icy weight in his stomach. S was not some distant, anonymous tormentor. S was here. Among them. Watching. The next message, arriving 2 nights later, was a far more grievous wound. It did not concern a lost object, but a lost soul. The young man who confessed to you on Tuesday afternoon is a poor liar, S wrote. He whispered to you of his regret, that the scent of another woman's perfume on his collar was a moment of weakness. But weakness is a seed. And I have seen the garden where he plants it. His wife is a fool to believe his contrition is sincere. Father Michael felt the air leave his lungs. He remembered the confession vividly. The shadowed silhouette, the choked voice, the precise, shame-filled words. That secret was protected by a sacrament, sealed by a vow made to God himself. No one could have heard it. The thick oak door, the heavy velvet curtain, they were designed for absolute privacy. To see those words repeated on the screen was a desecration of a magnitude he could barely comprehend. It was a violation of the sacred trust that was the very foundation of his calling. He felt a surge of rage, hot and righteous, quickly followed by a wave of numbing fear. Who, or what, could hear the whispers meant only for God's ears? SS message did not end there. A second sentence appeared, each word a drop of venom. Sins whispered in secret must be washed clean by suffering made public. He will pay for his lies. The threat was no longer veiled in metaphor. It was a clear and terrifying promise of retribution. The abstract cruelty of the garden had found a specific target. A member of his flock was now in the crosshairs of this malevolent, all-seeing entity. He felt a suffocating sense of helplessness. How could he warn the young man without revealing the source, without admitting the sanctity of his own confessional had been so utterly compromised? That very evening, as the last of the parish staff were leaving, a strange, acrid smell began to drift through the cloisters. Shouts followed, and the frantic clang of a fire extinguisher. A small blaze had broken out in the old sacristy, the small, windowless room where spare vestments and sacramental wine were stored. It was extinguished quickly, before it could spread to the main church, the damage contained to a few scorched robes and a blackened wall. The fire marshal, when he arrived, spoke of old, faulty wiring. A regrettable, but entirely explainable, accident. Coincidence, Father Michael whispered to himself, standing in the doorway of the smoky room. He repeated the word over and over, trying to force it to be true. But the word was a hollow shell, offering no comfort. The timing was too precise, the target too symbolic, a place of sacred preparation, now scarred by fire. His heart hammered in his throat like a trapped bird. This was not a coincidence. This was a message. A demonstration. A warning of the suffering that S had promised. The fire was an answer to the young man's whispered sin. Paranoia became the air he breathed. The familiar, comforting halls of the monastery now felt like a labyrinth of potential threats. He began to watch the others, Deacon Thomas, with his quiet, knowing eyes, Brother Samuel, who managed the church's website and servers, even the elderly, stooped janitor, who moved through the shadows with silent, unseen efficiency. Any one of them could be S. Any one of them could be the source of this insidious poison. He scrutinized their faces during meals, searching for a flicker of malice, a hint of the darkness that flooded his screen every night. He felt himself becoming a stranger to his own brothers. The easy camaraderie they once shared was replaced by a gnawing suspicion. Every quiet conversation could be a secret being gathered. Every glance could be an assessment. The church, his sanctuary, had transformed into a cage filled with potential enemies. He was utterly alone, isolated by a secret he could not possibly share. To speak of it would be to admit his own failure, to confess that the digital tool he had created to save souls had instead become a weapon aimed at their hearts. His interactions with his parishioners were now fraught with a terrible new weight. When they knelt before him for confession, he no longer saw them simply as souls seeking absolution. He saw them as potential victims, their secret frailties and hidden sins laid bare not just for him, but for the unseen predator that stalked his church. He would listen to their whispered admissions of guilt, and all he could think was, is listening too. The intimacy of the sacrament was poisoned, replaced by the terrifying possibility of a third, silent participant in the darkness of the confessional. Sleep offered no escape. His dreams were now a fusion of digital text and physical reality. He dreamt of fire alarms that chimed with the sound of a chat notification, of smoke that smelled of ozone from an overworked computer, of Mrs. Eleanora's silver brooch melting in the flames. He would wake up in a cold sweat, the phantom smell of smoke still in his nostrils, his mind racing, trying to connect dots that formed a picture of pure, incomprehensible evil. His faith was not just being questioned, it was being actively hunted. One night, a new message from S arrived, more chilling than any before. It was not a threat or a revelation of a new secret. It was a single, taunting question that seemed to read his mind, to know the precise shape of his new, all-consuming fear. Are you beginning to see, Father? The walls of your church are made of glass. And I am looking in. The words confirmed his terror. S was not just an observer, S was a conscious, interactive presence, enjoying the psychological torment he was inflicting. The game was not just about the parishioners, it was about him. He was the true audience. A period of deceptive calm settled over the parish, a quiet so profound it felt unnatural, like the held breath before a scream. For 3 days, the chat window remained dark. Father Michael found himself clinging to a desperate, foolish hope that the torment was over. He slept, and for the first time in weeks, his dreams were his own. He was beginning to believe he could reclaim his life from the digital phantom that had haunted it. The illusion was comforting. It was also a lie. On the 4th night, the notification chimed, and a single message appeared that plunged him into an abyss of panic so deep it felt like drowning. Little Anna stole money from the donation box. She confessed this to you on Sunday. She thinks that God has forgiven her. But I do not. She will pay tonight. The words were stark, stripped of all metaphor. This was not about a garden of bones or the philosophical nature of sin. This was a direct, specific threat against a child. A 12-year-old girl. His blood turned to ice in his veins. The abstract horror had just been given a name and a face, and the face was that of an innocent. He could see her in his mind's eye, small and terrified in the darkness of the confessional. He remembered her confession with perfect, agonizing clarity. She had not come in defiance, but in shame, her small body trembling. Through the screen, he had heard her choked, whispering voice, the tears thick in her throat as she admitted to taking a handful of coins, not for malice, but to buy a gift for her sick mother. He had felt a surge of paternal tenderness, his words of absolution meant to lift the crushing weight from her small shoulders. He had assured her of God's infinite, loving forgiveness. That moment, so private and sacred, had been spied upon, its purity stolen and twisted into a weapon. The knowledge that someone else had been privy to that moment was a profound desecration. It was a violation that struck at the very core of his priesthood. He felt an unseen gaze upon him, a presence that could permeate the thick oak of the church, the encryption of his own website, and pierce the sanctity of a sacrament. It was a gaze that saw everything, a presence that judged everything, and a will that was now poised to exact its own terrible penance upon a child. He was no longer a pastor, a shepherd protecting his flock. He was an unwilling accomplice, a spectator in a ghastly arena where his parishioners were the prey, and the hunter wore the mask of a single letter. Panic, cold and absolute, flooded his mind. It was a tidal wave of helplessness that swept away all rational thought. He stood up, knocking his chair over with a clatter that echoed loudly in the silent cell. He had to do something. He had to warn them. But how? What could he possibly say to Anna's parents? There is an anonymous entity on my confession website who knows your daughter stole coins and has threatened to make her pay tonight. They would think he was a lunatic. They might even suspect him. His warning would be dismissed as madness, and he would be exposed, his ministry ruined. The seal of the confessional, once a sacred shield, was now the bars of his cage. He was bound by his holy vow to never reveal what was spoken in that sacred space. But S was bound by nothing. S used the sacrament as a weapon, twisting the priest's own vows into a tool of paralysis. To protect Anna, he would have to betray his oath. To uphold his oath, he would have to abandon her to an unknown, monstrous fate. There was no right choice. There was only a spiraling vortex of damnation, and he was at its center, utterly and completely alone. He paced the confines of his small room, his footsteps a frantic, repetitive beat against the cold stone floor. The walls seemed to be closing in, the air growing thin and difficult to breathe. He looked at the crucifix, its serene and suffering face offering no guidance, no solace. His prayers had been answered not with divine light, but with this encroaching, intelligent darkness. He was a general who had opened the city gates to a new legion of converts, only to realize he had welcomed in a plague that was now consuming his people from the inside out, starting with the most vulnerable. He felt the presence of S everywhere now. The shadows in the corner of his room seemed to coalesce and watch him. The gentle breeze rattling the old windowpane sounded like a dry, mocking laugh. His church, his home, his sanctuary, was no longer a safe haven. It was the hunting ground. And he had unwittingly provided the hunter with a perfect, invisible blind from which to observe the flock, learn their weaknesses, and choose the moment to strike. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest, making it impossible to draw a full breath. The hours began to crawl by with agonizing slowness. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bloody streaks of crimson and orange before surrendering to the deep, starless black of night. Every tick of the old clock on the wall was a hammer blow, marking the passage of time, bringing the moment of Anna's promised payment closer and closer. He thought of her, asleep in her bed, blissfully unaware of the terrible judgment that had been passed upon her in the digital ether. The image was a torment that drove him to his knees. He stumbled into the small chapel, the air thick with the scent of cold incense and old prayer. He knelt before the altar, but no words came. His faith felt like a hollowed-out gourd, emptied of all its substance. How could he ask for protection from a God who allowed this? Who remained silent while a monster used the sacred act of confession as a target list? His pleas felt like nothing more than echoes in an empty, indifferent chamber. The only active, listening presence in his world now was the one that signed its name with a single, damning letter. He understood with chilling certainty that this was an escalation born of pure sadism. The cheating husband, the stolen brooch, those were tests. This was the true beginning of the game. S had chosen a child not because her sin was great, but because her innocence was. The target was not the sin itself, but the priest's response to it. S was not merely punishing his parishioners, S was torturing him, using their fates as the instruments of his psychological deconstruction. His pain, his helplessness, his crisis of faith, that was the true objective. The moon rose, a pale, sickly crescent in the night sky. The monastery was utterly silent, a tomb of sleeping men oblivious to the spiritual warfare being waged within its walls. Father Michael sat at his desk, the laptop dark, its screen a black mirror reflecting his own pale, haunted face. He was a watchman on a wall, waiting for a blow he could not see and could not stop. He did not know what form the payment would take. A fire. An accident. Something worse. The not knowing was a unique and exquisitely crafted hell. He could do nothing but sit, and wait, and listen for the sound of a child's world breaking. The night passed in a state of suspended animation. Father Michael did not sleep. He sat in his chair, a statue carved from fear, listening to the ancient monastery breathe around him. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of wind in the ivy outside his window was the sound of the coming horror. He pictured a dozen different terrible scenarios, each more vivid and cruel than the last. He waited for a scream, for the distant wail of a siren, for the frantic ringing of the telephone. But the night offered only a profound and terrifying silence. The silence of a hunter waiting patiently in a blind. Just after dawn, his phone buzzed on the desk, the vibration unnaturally loud in the still air. His heart seized in his chest. He fumbled for it, his hand trembling so badly it took 3 attempts to answer. It was Anna's mother. Her voice was cheerful, oblivious. She was calling to thank him for his guidance, to tell him that Anna had woken up that morning and, unprompted, had returned the small gift she had bought and confessed to her mother, who had forgiven her with a hug. Anna felt so much lighter, she had said. So free. The line went dead. Relief did not come. In its place, a realization bloomed, cold and black and utterly monstrous. Nothing had happened to Anna. The threat had been a lie. Or rather, the threat had not been aimed at her at all. It had been aimed directly at him. S had not wanted to harm a child. S had wanted him to spend 8 hours in the abyss, imagining it. The cruelty of it, the sheer psychological sadism, was more profound than any physical violence. This was not a mindless monster. This was an artist, and his chosen medium was the torment of a priest's soul. And with that chilling clarity, a new thought burned through the fog of his terror like a hot iron. This was not supernatural. A demon would have reveled in actual destruction. This intricate, patient, psychological game, this was human. Terribly, intimately human. The knowledge S possessed was not omniscient. It was gathered. The whispers in the confessional, the details of parish life. S was not a ghost looking through the walls. S was someone already inside. Someone who belonged here. One of his own. His mind, sharpened by a new and terrifying focus, began to build a list. It had to be someone with both physical access and a deep understanding of the church's inner workings. Deacon Thomas, a young and fiercely intelligent man who had openly questioned the wisdom of the anonymous chat, viewing it as a modern perversion of a sacred rite. Did he harbor enough resentment to orchestrate such a cruel, "I told you so"? To prove the folly of Michael's ambition by turning it into a weapon against him. The motive was there, rooted in theological pride. Or perhaps Brother Samuel. The quiet, almost invisible man who managed the monastery's small IT network. He had helped Michael set up the secure server for the chat. He had access to everything, a quiet administrator with God-level privileges. He moved through their digital lives as silently as he moved through the cloisters. What secret resentments might fester in such a quiet heart? He had the technical means to bypass any encryption, to be a ghost in the machine, listening to every secret, every confession, undetected. The most blasphemous thought, the one he tried to push away, was of the old abbot himself. Father Elia, a man whose knowledge of the human soul was as deep and ancient as the stones of the monastery. He had access to every record, every key, every secret whispered within these walls for the past 50 years. Could this all be some impossibly cruel test? A trial by fire, designed by a spiritual master to burn away Michael's modern pride and expose the true nature of the evil he had so naively invited into their midst. The thought was a violation of everything he held sacred. The idea of betrayal was an agony, a twisting knife in his soul. These men were his brothers, his family. He broke bread with them, prayed with them, lived a life of shared devotion. But the pain of this suspicion was different from the formless, existential dread he had been living in. That was a paralyzing fog. This was a solid thing. It gave the enemy a face, or at least a list of possible faces. An enemy of flesh and blood, no matter how clever or cruel, could be fought. A phantom that fed on secrets could be starved. This false sense of control was the first breath of air he'd had in weeks. He looked at the laptop on his desk and saw it with new eyes. It was not a tool. It was a feeding trough. He had created it, and he had filled it with the most potent food imaginable, the secret sins and vulnerabilities of his flock. The entire digital archive, the record of every confession made over the past 2 years, was the source of SS power. It was the well from which the poison was drawn. To stop the monster, he had to destroy the ecosystem that sustained it. The decision came not as a thought, but as a convulsive, physical imperative. A feverish, desperate need to act. He sat down at the computer, his purpose a cold, hard stone in his gut. This was his creation, his sin, and it demanded his penance. His fingers flew across the keyboard, his movements no longer hesitant but driven by a frantic, purging energy. He bypassed the simple user interface and logged directly into the server's command line, the stark black screen and blinking cursor a fitting backdrop for the scorched earth campaign he was about to wage. He was no longer a priest offering counsel, he was a desperate soldier poisoning his own wells before the enemy could reach them. He located the primary database, the encrypted file containing 2 years of human weakness. He typed the command for permanent deletion, the letters appearing stark white against the black. For a single, fleeting moment, he hesitated. He thought of all the souls who had found solace in this digital space, of the good he had tried to do. It felt like burning down a hospital to kill a single disease. But the disease was airborne, and every patient was already infected. He pressed the enter key with brutal finality. A progress bar began to slowly fill. It was not enough. He knew there were backups, safeguards he himself had put in place. The local weekly backup, stored on a separate drive in the server rack. He navigated to it, its existence a testament to his former prudence and current folly. He did not just delete it, he initiated a secure wipe protocol, commanding the system to overwrite the data 7 times with random characters, an act of digital annihilation. He could hear his own ragged breathing in the silence of the cell, a counterpoint to the quiet hum of the machine. The final vulnerability, the off-site cloud backup, the ultimate failsafe against a fire or a flood. It was the last Horcrux. He opened a web browser, his hands slick with sweat, and logged into the secure third-party server. He moved through layers of authentication, each one a reminder of the security he had once trusted. He found the archive, a single, massive file sitting in the sterile quiet of a remote server farm, and issued the final command. The system asked for confirmation, a small pop-up window, this action is irreversible. He clicked yes. He clicked it again and again, his finger hammering the mouse button as if he were physically striking his enemy, stabbing at the heart of the beast. The system processed the request, and the file icon vanished. He navigated back to the root directory. Where there had been a meticulously organized archive of faith and frailty, there was now nothing. Just a blank white field. He had done it. He had burned his own creation to the ground. He had exorcised the demon from the machine. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the empty screen, feeling not victory, but a profound and terrifying emptiness. 24 hours passed in a profound and unnerving silence. The laptop remained on the desk, a dead thing, its screen dark. No notifications chimed. No cryptic messages appeared. Father Michael moved through the day in a haze, performing his duties by rote, his senses on high alert for any sign that the silence was a lie. He watched Deacon Thomas at prayer and saw only piety. He observed Brother Samuel in the refectory and saw only quiet weariness. The faces of his brothers were just faces again, stripped of the monstrous potential he had projected onto them. The world was slowly returning to its normal shape and color. By the second day, a fragile, ghostly relief began to take root in the scorched soil of his soul. It was not joy, not yet. It was something more delicate, the cautious hope of a man who has survived a long and terrible fever. He ate a meal and tasted the food. He walked in the monastery garden and felt the warmth of the afternoon sun on his face. These simple sensations felt like miracles, like gifts returned to him from a life he thought was lost forever. The constant, thrumming anxiety that had been his companion for weeks had subsided to a low, manageable hum. He had faced the demon in the machine and, through an act of radical destruction, he had banished it. That evening, he did something he had not done in a long time. He did not go to his cell to stare at a dead screen. Instead, drawn by an instinct older than any technology, he went to the main church. The vast nave was empty and silent, lit only by the single, eternally burning sanctuary lamp, its small red flame a symbol of a presence he was desperately trying to feel again. The air was cool and thick with the layered scents of old wood, beeswax, and the faint, sweet memory of incense. This was the source. This was the reality he had tried to digitize, and he needed to reconnect with it now. He walked to the row of confessionals, their dark wood gleaming faintly in the low light. He opened the door to his side, the priest's side, and slipped inside, the familiar enclosure a comforting embrace. He sat on the simple wooden bench, the worn velvet of the kneeler beside him a testament to 1,000 whispered sins, 1,000 acts of grace. This was real. The smell, the texture, the profound, sacred quiet. This was the antidote to the cold, sterile poison of the chat room. Here, there were no screens, no notifications, only the possibility of a human soul reaching out in the darkness. He sat there for what felt like an hour, breathing deeply, letting the silence wash over him, cleansing him. He was trying to piece together the shattered remnants of his faith. He had invited a great evil into his world through his own pride, his own modern ambition. But he had also, he believed, found the strength to cast it out. Perhaps this had been his trial, his dark night of the soul. He had been shown the true face of an evil that could wear any mask, even a technological one, and he had survived. He had learned a terrible, necessary lesson. A feeling of profound, weary peace began to settle over him. It was in that moment of fragile, emerging peace that his phone, lying forgotten on the bench beside him, lit up. It made no sound. The screen simply bloomed with a soft, white light in the deep shadows of the confessional. It was not a call or a standard text alert. The message was just there. It had bypassed the lock screen, appearing as a stark, black text on a white background. There was no sender. No number. No header from any application. It was an impossible message, delivered by an impossible means, and it consisted of two short, simple sentences. I no longer need an intermediary. I am already sitting across from you. Time stopped. The air in the small booth became thick and suffocating. His blood felt as if it had turned to ice water. The words on the screen were a denial of everything he had just allowed himself to believe. The enemy was not human. The archive had not been its source of power, merely a tool it had used for a time. He had not banished it. He had only severed a single, temporary line of communication. He had burned down the post office, but the sender was already standing at his door. He was not a victor. He was a fool. And in that same, frozen second, before he could even draw a breath to scream, the echoing silence of the empty church was torn apart by a sound. It was not loud, but it was impossibly, terrifyingly clear. A distinct, dry creak of old wood under weight. It was the sound of the door to the other side of the confessional, the penitent's side, swinging open and immediately clicking shut. He had heard that sound thousands of times. But now, in the dead silence, it was the most horrific sound he had ever known. Then came another sound, soft and intimate and directly opposite him, separated only by a thin screen of dark wood and black cloth. It was the rustle of heavy fabric, the unmistakable sound of someone slowly, deliberately, and heavily lowering themselves onto the bench in the darkness. He was no longer alone. The watcher was no longer behind a screen miles away or hidden among the faces in the pews. It was here. It was now. It was 3 feet away, shrouded in the absolute darkness of the sacrament, waiting for him to slide open the panel and begin the confession.